territory near the pine forests, a cabin so broken it barely kept the wind out, a man who owned nothing but the clothes he wore and a tin cup for water. But when Dalton Keyes woke that morning and saw the small footprints circling his property, he had no idea those tracks belonged to someone's daughters. And he certainly didn't know that by sunset he would make a choice that would bring hundreds of Apache warriors to his doorstep. What he did for two lost children would either be his final act or the one that changed everything. The door hung crooked on leather hinges that should have been replaced months ago. Dalton pushed it open with his shoulder, the way he always did, and stepped into the cold morning air. The cabin behind him sagged to one side, its roof patched with bark and mud. He'd been meaning to fix it properly, but when you live alone this far from anything that resembled a town, plans had a way of staying plans. He walked toward the small creek that ran behind the property, carrying his tin cup. That's when he saw them, footprints small and deliberate, pressed into the damp earth near the water's edge, child-sized too. Sets, moving in circles like they'd been searching for something. Dalton crouched down, running his fingers along the edge of one print, fresh, made within the last few hours, maybe less. His chest tightened. Children didn't wander this far into the backcountry alone, not unless something had gone terribly wrong. He stood slowly scanning the tree and nothing moved except the branches swaying in the wind, but the stillness felt wrong, too deliberate, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it, a whimper, muffled and desperate, coming from somewhere past the thick cluster of pines to his left. Dalton moved toward the sound without thinking, his boots crunching softly over fallen needles. He pushed through the low branches and stopped. Two girls sat huddled against the base of a massive tree, their arms wrapped around each other. They couldn't have been more than 8 or 10 years old. Their clothes marked them immediately. Traditional Apache leather with intricate beadwork, now dusty and torn. Their faces were strewn with dirt, their eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. The older one saw him first. She jerked back, pulling her sister closer. Her small hands clenched into fists. Her lips were cracked, her breathing shallow. Dalton raised both hands slowly, palms open. He didn't speak. Words wouldn't help. They wouldn't understand him anyway, and his voice might only make things worse. Instead, he took one step back, then another. He kept his eyes low, non-threatening, and moved sideways toward the creek. He knelt down, filled his tin cup with water, and set it on the ground between them. The girls stared at the cup like it might be a trap. Dalton backed away. Again, giving them space, he sat down on a fallen log about 10 feet away and waited. The older girl watched him with the kind of suspicion that came from experience. Someone had taught her not to trust strangers. Smart girl. Minutes passed, the sun climbed higher, but neither of them moved. Then the younger one whispered something in a language Dalton didn't know. The older girl shook her head sharply, but her eyes kept darting back to the cup. Dalton stayed perfectly still. He learned a long time ago that patience was the only currency that mattered out here. You couldn't force trust. You could only offer it and hope it got returned. Finally, the older girl moved. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, never taking her eyes off him, and grabbed the cup. She brought it to her sister first, holding it to her lips, while the younger one drank in desperate gulps. Dalton exhaled slowly. It was a start. He pointed back toward his cabin, then mimicked eating and drinking. The older girl's eyes narrowed, but she didn't pull away. That's when Dalton noticed something that made his blood run cold. Faint bruises on the younger girl's arms, scratches across both their legs, and the way they kept glancing over their shoulders like they expected something or someone to come crashing through the trees at any moment. They weren't just lost, they were running from something, and whatever it was, Dalton had a sinking feeling it wouldn't be long before it found them. Dalton stood slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He gestured again toward the cabin, this time more insistently. The older girl watched him with those sharp, calculating eyes. She whispered something to her sister, who shook her head frantically. But thirst and exhaustion were stronger than fear. The older girl finally nodded, helping her sister to her feet. They moved like wounded animals, cautious, ready to bolt at the slightest wrong move. Dalton walked ahead, giving them space to follow at their own pace. He didn't look back. Looking back would feel like hurting them, and that would shatter whatever fragile trust he'd managed to build. The cabin looked even worse from the outside than it felt from the inside. The walls leaned inward, held up more by habit than by any structural integrity. The roof sagged in the middle where the support beam had cracked last winter. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. He pushed the crooked door open and stepped aside, letting them see inside first. The interior was sparse. A wooden bench he'd built himself, a small iron stove with a dented pot sitting on top, a pile of blankets in the corner that served as his bed. No decoration, no comfort, nothing that wasn't absolutely necessary. The girls hesitated at the threshold. The younger one grabbed her sister's arm, her eyes darting around the single room like she was looking for traps. Dalton moved to the stove and started building a fire. He worked slowly, deliberately, so they could see exactly what he was doing. He filled the pot with water from a bucket near the door and set it on the stove to heat. Then he reached into a wooden crate and pulled out 2 pieces of dried meat, nearly the last of his supplies, and placed them on the bench. He stepped back to the far wall and sat down on the floor, making himself as small and non-threatening as possible. The older girl entered first, pulling her sister behind her. They moved along the wall, keeping maximum distance between themselves and Dalton. When they reached the bench, the older girl grabbed the meat and handed 1 piece to her sister. They ate quickly, desperately, barely chewing. Dalton watched the pot, waiting for the water to heat. The silence in the cabin felt heavy, loaded with unspoken questions. Who were these girls? How long had they been wandering? And more importantly, where was their family? That last thought sent a chill through him. Apache didn't let their children wander off alone. If these girls were out here, something catastrophic must have happened. Either they'd been separated during an attack, or they'd run from something so terrifying that staying put seemed worse than facing the wilderness alone. The water began to steam. Dalton poured it into 2 tin cups and set them on the bench beside the girls. The younger one reached for hers immediately, cradling it between her small hands like it was something precious. As the afternoon light began to fade, the temperature dropped. Dalton pulled the pile of blankets from the corner and offered them to the girls. The older one took them reluctantly, wrapping one around her sister's shoulders. Dalton moved back to his spot against the wall. He wouldn't sleep tonight. Couldn't sleep, not with 2 frightened children in his cabin and the very real possibility that someone or something was hunting them. Hours passed. The girls eventually huddled together under the blankets, their breathing finally evening out into something that resembled rest. Dalton's eyes grew heavy, but he forced them open. That's when he heard it, distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The sound of horses, not 1 or 2, many, and they were getting closer. His hand instinctively moved to the wall where his rifle hung, but he didn't reach for it. Not yet. Reaching for a weapon now might wake the girls, and the last thing he needed was panic. He stood quietly and moved to the window, just a square hole covered with oilcloth. He pulled the cloth back slightly and looked out into the darkness. Nothing, just shadows and the faint rustle of wine through the pines. But the sound of hooves continued, steady, methodical. Surrounding, Dalton's throat went dry. Whatever was coming wasn't passing through. It was closing in. Dawn broke with an unnatural silence. No birds sang. No wind moved through the trees. The forest itself seemed to be waiting. Dalton hadn't slept. He'd spent the entire night with his back against the wall, listening to those distant hoof beatots circle his property like wolves around wounded prey. They never came closer, never moved away, just maintained their distance, patient and deliberate. The girls were still asleep, curled together under the blankets. Their faces looked peaceful for the first time since he'd found them. Dalton envied that peace. His own chest felt like it was being crushed by it. invisible weight. He stood slowly, his knees protesting from hours of sitting in one position. He moved to the window and pulled back the cloth covering. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. They weren't just surrounded, they were encircled by an army. Hundreds of Apache warriors sat motionless on horseback, forming a perfect ring around his property. They stretched from the tree inn all the way to the creek, their numbers so vast that Dalton couldn't see where the formation ended. Each warrior sat in complete stillness, their faces painted, their weapons held ready, but not raised. Dalton's hand gripped the windowsill to steady himself. This wasn't a hunting party. This wasn't a small group searching for two lost children. This was a full war patrol, the kind of force that could wipe out an entire settlement without breaking stride. And they were here at his cabin because of those two girls sleeping behind him. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. They tracked the girls here. They knew he had them. And now they were waiting for him to make the first move or the first mistake. Dalton looked back at the sleeping children. The younger one stirred, her face scrunching up as consciousness slowly returned. In a few moments, she'd be awake, and then she'd see what was waiting outside. He had to make a decision, stay inside and hope. They'd negotiate, step outside unarmed, and try to explain there was no good option. Any move he made could be interpreted as aggression, and aggression against this many warriors would end exactly one way. The older girl's eyes snapped open. She sat up quickly, her hand reaching protectively for her sister. Then she saw Dalton's face, saw the tension there, and her expression shifted from sleep to alarm in an instant. She scrambled to her feet and moved to the window. Dalton stepped aside, letting her see. The girl's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the cabin. She stared at the massive formation outside, her hands trembling. Then she said something in her language, a single word repeated like a prayer or a plea. Dalton didn't need a translation. He understood the tone, fear, recognition, and something else he couldn't quite place. The younger girl woke fully now, rubbing her eyes. When she saw her sister's face, she started to cry, soft, hitching sobs that broke the oppressive silence. Dalton moved to the door. His hand rested on the rough wood, feeling the splinters dig into his palm. Every instinct screamed at him to stay inside, to barricade the door, to do anything except step out into that killing field. But he knew the truth. Staying inside wouldn't save him. If they wanted him dead, these walls wouldn't stop them. The cabin would become his coffin, not his fortress. He looked back at the girls one more time. The older one met his eyes, and for just a moment, something passed between them. And understanding she knew what he was about to do, Dalton pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. He stepped out into the morning light, his hands raised and empty, showing he carried no weapons. The circle of warriors remained motionless. Not a single horse shifted, not a single man moved. Dalton took 3 steps forward, putting himself in clear view of every warrior in that formation. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it might crack them. Then, from somewhere in the vast ring of warriors, a single rider began to move forward. The man sat taller than the others, his bearing unmistakably that of a leader. His face was weathered and severe, marked with paint that ran in sharp lines across his cheeks. He rode slowly toward Dalton, closing the distance between them with measured precision. Dalton stood his ground, though every muscle in his body screamed at him to run. The leader stopped his horse 10 feet away. His eyes swept over Dalton, taking in the shabby clothes, the broken cabin, the desperate poverty of the scene. Then his gaze shifted past Dalton to the open doorway where both girls now stood. Watching, the leader's eyes locked onto the girls, and something shifted in his expression, something Dalton couldn't quite read. Not anger, not relief, something deeper, more complex. The older girl took a step forward, then another. Her sister followed, clinging to her hand. They moved past Dalton like he'd become invisible, their entire focus on the man sitting tall on his horse. When they reached the edge of the porch, the younger girl broke free and ran. She ran straight toward the leader, her small feet kicking up dust, her arms reaching upward. The man dismounted in one fluid motion and dropped to one knee. The little girl crashed into him, wrapping her arms around his neck with desperate strength. Her shoulders shook with sobs, not from fear this time, but from pure relief. The older girl walked forward more slowly, maintaining her composure, but Dalton could see her hands trembling. When she reached the man, he opened one arm and pulled her close as well, his hand cradling the back of her head. Dalton's chest loosened slightly. Father, the word echoed in his mind with absolute certainty. This man wasn't just a leader, he was their father, which meant the hundreds of warriors surrounding this property weren't a war party. They were a rescue mission, and Dalton had been standing in the middle of it, holding the two things this man valued most in the world. The father spoke to his daughters in their language, his voice low and urgent. The older girl responded, her words tumbling out in rapid succession. She pointed back at the cabin, then at Dalton, her hands gesturing as she explained something. Dalton remained motionless, acutely aware that every warrior in that circle was watching him. One wrong move, one gesture that could be misinterpreted, and he'd be cut down before he could blink. The father listened to his daughter's account, his eyes never leaving Dalton's face. His expression gave nothing away. No gratitude, no hostility, just intense scrutiny. He was measuring Dalton, weighing him against some internal standard that only he understood. The younger girl said something, tugging on her father's sleeve. She pointed at the cabin again, more insistently this time. The father stood, lifting the younger girl with one arm while keeping his other hand on the older girl's shoulder. He walked toward Dalton with slow, deliberate steps. Each footfall seemed to echo despite the soft earth beneath them. Dalton forced himself to stay still, his hands still raised and open. The father stopped just 3 feet away, close enough that Dalton could see the pain on his face in sharp detail, close enough to count the scars that marked his weathered skin. The man's eyes moved past Dalton to the open doorway of the cabin. He studied the interior, the broken furniture, the cracked walls, the single pot on the stove. His gaze lingered on the wooden bench where the dried meat had been, now empty because Dalton had given it all to the girls. Then his eyes dropped to the ground near the doorway, where the tin cup still sat, the same cup Dalton had first offered by the creek. The father looked back at Dalton, and for the first time, something flickered in those dark eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. He spoke a single word in his language, his voice carrying enough weight that several warriors in the circle shifted on their horses. Then he turned to his older daughter and spoke again, this time in a questioning tone. The girl nodded emphatically, then spoke at length, her hands gesturing toward Dalton, toward the cabin, toward the forest where he'd found them. The father listened without interruption. When she finished, silence fell over the entire clearing. Even the horses seemed to sense the gravity of whatever decision was being made. The father handed his younger daughter to one of the warriors who had moved closer. Then he walked past Dalton right into the cabin. Dalton's breath caught. He didn't dare turn around, didn't dare follow. He stood frozen on his own porch while this man, this leader of hundreds, walked through his home uninvited. He could hear footsteps inside, the scrape of something being moved, the creak of old wood underweight. Minutes passed, like hours. Then the father emerged, holding something in his hand, the blankets, the ones Dalton had given the girls to keep them warm through the night. The father held them up, examining the worn fabric, the patches sewn with rough thread. These weren't fine blankets. They were all Dalton-owned. The man's jaw tightened. He looked at Dalton again, and this time something had definitely changed in his expression. He spoke another word, sharp and commanding, and the entire circle of warriors responded as one. The warriors dismounted simultaneously, the sound of hundreds of feet hitting the ground, creating a thunder that rolled across the clearing. Dalton's heart nearly stopped. This was it. Whatever judgment had been passed, it was about to be carried out, but instead of drawing weapons, the warriors simply stood beside their horses, waiting. Their posture had shifted, no longer poised for attack, but not relaxed either. They looked like men awaiting orders, not men preparing for violence. The father walked past Dalton. Again, moving to the side of the cabin, he examined the walls, running his hand along the weathered wood. He saw where the roof sagged, where the door hung crooked, where every surface showed years of neglect and poverty. Then he walked to the creek. He knelt beside the water and looked at the bank where Dalton had first filled his cup. The footprints were still there, his own larger ones, and the two small sets belonging to the girls. He could see the timeline written in the dirt, the girls drinking desperately, Dalton backing away to give them space. The father stood and returned to where Dalton waited. His daughters had moved to his side, flanking him like small guards. The older girl spoke again, her voice more urgent now. She grabbed her father's hand and placed it on her own chest, then gestured emphatically at Dalton. The father listened, his face unreadable. Then he did something that stunned Dalton completely. He reached to his belt and removed a leather pouch. He opened it and pulled out several strips of dried venison, quality meat, far better than anything Dalton had in his cabin. He held it out. Dalton stared at the offering, his mind racing. Was this a trade? A test? He didn't know the customs, didn't know the protocols. Taking it might be an insult. Refusing it might be worse. The father waited, his hand extended, his eyes locked on Dalton's face. Dalton's hands were still, raised and empty. Slowly, carefully, he lowered one hand and accepted the meat. His fingers brushed the father's palm, calloused, scarred, the hands of a warrior who had seen countless battles. The father nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Then he turned and spoke to the warriors in a voice that carried across the entire clearing. His tone wasn't harsh, but it held absolute authority. This was a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Several warriors moved forward, dismounting and approaching the cabin. Dalton tensed, but forced himself to remain still. They walked past him with barely a glance. Entering his home, he heard them moving. Inside, heard things being shifted. His instinct screamed to stop them, to defend his property, but he swallowed that impulse. Whatever was happening, interfering would only make it worse. The warriors emerged minutes later, carrying bundles, furs, dried meat, what looked like tightly woven baskets. They set these items on the porch, then returned to their horses without a word. More warriors approached, repeating the process. Bundle after bundle appeared on Dalton's porch, stacked neatly and deliberately. The father watched this procession with the same unreadable expression. When the last warrior had placed his bundle and returned to his horse, the father spoke again. This time his words were directed at Dalton. The language barrier made comprehension impossible, but the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't a threat. It was a statement, a declaration. The older girl translated, her voice small but clear, speaking in broken but understandable words. Father, say you give water, you give food, you give warm, you give all you have. She paused, searching for the right words. He say we give back, honor for honor. Dalton's throat tightened. He looked at the supplies stacked on his porch. Enough food to last him months. Furs that would keep him warm through the next winter. Baskets filled with what looked like seeds and dried herbs. They'd given him more than he'd given them, far more. The father placed his hand over his heart, then extended it toward Dalton. Palm open, fingers spread, a gesture that needed no translation. Respect. Then he turned to his daughters and spoke quietly. The girls approached Dalton, and the older one reached into a small pouch at her waist. She pulled out something small and placed it in his hand, a stone, smooth and dark with a single white line running through it like a river. Protection, she said simply. You protected us, now we protect you. The father mounted his horse, lifting both girls up with him. He looked at Dalton. One final time, and something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his weathered face. Then he spoke, "A command," and the entire circle of warriors mounted their horses in perfect unison. They didn't leave immediately. They sat there hundreds strong, facing Dalton's humble cabin, and then as one. They raised their weapons skyward in salute. The salute held for 3 heartbeats. Then, as one, the warriors lowered their weapons and turned their horses. The father gave one final nod to Dalton before guiding his mount toward the tree inn. His daughters held securely in front of him. The massive formation began to move, not in chaos or haste, but with military precision. They filed out in organized columns, the sound of hoof beats gradually fading as they disappeared into the forest. Within minutes, the clearing was empty, except for the dust hanging in the air and the stacks of supplies on Dalton's porch. Dalton stood alone, the smooth stone still clutched in his hand. His legs felt unsteady, like they might give out at any moment. The tension that had coiled in his chest for the past 12 hours finally released, and he sagged against the doorframe. He looked at the bundles surrounding him, furs thick, enough to turn aside winter's worst bite, dried meat that would keep him fed for months, woven baskets containing things he couldn't even identify yet. They'd given him more than survival supplies. They'd given him dignity back. For years, Dalton had lived on the edge of nothing, scraping by with just enough to see another day. He'd accepted that. Reality had even made peace with it, but this changed everything. He picked up one of the fur bundles and brought it inside. Then another. It took him nearly an hour to move everything into the cabin, and by the time he finished, the single room felt crowded with abundance. Dalton sat on his bench, the same bench where the girls had eaten his last pieces of meat, and opened one of the baskets. Inside, he found dried berries, seeds he recognized as corn, and small pouches of what smelled like medicinal herbs. Everything carefully prepared, everything useful. He thought about the father's face when he'd examined the blankets, the way his jaw had tightened when he saw how little Dalton actually owned. The man had understood something important in that moment, that Dalton hadn't helped his daughters because he had plenty to spare. He'd helped them because it was the right thing to do, even when it cost him everything. That kind of character meant something to the Apache. It meant enough to mobilize hundreds of warriors, not for war, but for honor. Dalton ran his thumb over the smooth stone. The older girl had given him protection, she'd said. He didn't fully understand what that meant, but he could guess in giving him this token. They'd marked him as someone under their regard, someone not to be harmed. That protection was worth more than all the supplies combined. Days passed. Dalton used the furs to patch his roof properly for the first time in years. The dried meat meant he didn't have to spend every waking hour hunting or trapping. Planted the seeds near the creek where the soil held moisture better. For the first time since he'd built this cabin, he had breathing room, time to think about something other than immediate survival. He caught himself looking toward the tree and often, half expecting to see riders emerge. But the forest remained quiet, undisturbed except for the usual wildlife. 3 weeks after the encounter, Dalton woke to find something on his porch, a small bundle wrapped in leather and tied with sinew. He hadn't heard anyone approach during the night, hadn't heard any horses or footsteps. He opened the bundle carefully. Inside he found more dried meat, another pouch of herbs, and something else, a piece of worked leather with intricate beadwork along its edge. The pattern was complex, beautiful, clearly made by skilled hands. A gift left in the night by someone who wanted him to know he hadn't been forgotten. Dalton looked at the tree again, and this time he thought. He saw movement, just a flicker of shadow that might have been a person or might have been nothing at all. He raised his hand in acknowledgement, not knowing if anyone was actually there to see it. The shadow, if it had been there at all, disappeared, but the message was clear. The Apache remembered, and they were watching over him, not as a threat, as a promise kept. The seasons changed. Summer gave way to autumn, and Dalton watched as the corn he'd planted grew tall beside the creek. The seeds from The Apache baskets had taken root in soil that had never produced anything before, and now green stalks swayed in. The wind, like proof of something he couldn't quite name, his cabin no longer sagged. The roof held firm against the rain, sealed with pitch and covered with the thick furs they'd given him. The door hung straight on new leather hinges. He'd fashioned himself. It wasn't a grand house, but it was solid. It was home. Other things changed. 2 hunters who passed through the area, rough men who would have ignored or robbed someone like Dalton before, now gave him a wide berth and a respectful nod. Word had spread somehow. Word that this cabin was marked, that the man who lived here had earned something rare. Dalton never spoke about what had happened. When travelers asked, he simply said he'd helped some folks once, and they'd repaid the favor. That was all anyone needed to know, but he thought about those too. Girls often wondered if they were safe, if they'd grown, if they remembered the stranger who'd shared his water and his blankets. He hoped they did. He hoped they understood that kindness wasn't about having plenty, it was about giving what you could when it mattered most. One afternoon, as Dalton was working near the creek, he heard horses approaching. His hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning against a nearby tree, but he didn't pick it up, just waited, watching the tree line. 3 riders emerged, Apache warriors there, faces painted for travel rather than war. They stopped at the edge of his property, maintaining respectful distance. The lead rider dismounted and walked forward slowly, his hands visible and empty. He was younger than the father had been, maybe in his 20s, with sharp eyes that took in everything. He spoke in halting, broken words. "You, Dalton Keyes?" It wasn't a question. Somehow they knew his name, though he'd never told anyone. Dalton nodded. "I am." The young warrior gestured to the others. They dismounted and approached, carrying something wrapped in hide. They set it on the ground between them and stepped back. "From Nako," the warrior said, struggling with the unfamiliar. "Sounds leader, father of daughters you saved." Nako, so that was his name, the father who had surrounded this place with hundreds of warriors and turned threat into honor. He sends gratitude. "Always." The warrior touched his chest, then extended his hand toward Dalton. "You protected forever." Dalton understood. This wasn't just another gift. This was a formal declaration. Whatever protection that stone represented, it was being reinforced, made official. As long as Nako lived, Dalton would be under Apache regard. The warrior gestured to the bundle. Open, Dalton knelt and unwrapped the hide carefully. Inside, he found a bow knot. Ornate, but perfectly crafted, the wood shaped with incredible skill. Beside it lay a quiver of arrows, each one fletched with precision. "For hunting," the warrior explained, "for living." Dalton ran his hand along the bow's smooth surface. It was a weapon, yes, but more than that, it was trust. The Apache were giving him the means to sustain himself, to thrive rather than merely survive. "Tell Nako," Dalton paused, searching for the right words. "Tell him I'm grateful, and tell him his daughters were brave, strong. He should be proud." The warrior's stern face softened slightly. "He is proud of them. Of you." He placed his fist over his heart. "Honor recognizes honor." They stayed only a few minutes more, then mounted their horses and rode back into the forest. But this time Dalton noticed something. As they disappeared into the trees, he caught glimpses of other riders, sentries posted at intervals, watching over his property from concealed positions. They'd always been there, he realized, ever since that day. The Apache hadn't just given him gifts and left. They'd stationed guards, kept watch, made sure no harm came to the man who protected their own. Dalton looked at the bow in his hands, then at his cabin, then at the forest surrounding his property. He wasn't isolated anymore. He wasn't forgotten or abandoned. He was protected. And for a man who'd spent years alone, that meant everything. Winter came hard that year, but Dalton barely noticed. His cabin stood firm against the wind, sealed and warm. The furs kept the cold at bay, and the dried meat lasted through the lean months when hunting became difficult. He used the bow Nako had sent and found it shot truer than any weapon he'd ever held. On the coldest nights, when snow piled against his door and the forest went silent, Dalton would sit by his fire, and think about that morning. The morning he'd found two small sets of footprints by the creek. If he'd ignored them, if he decided those tracks weren't his problem, his life would look completely different now. He'd still be scraping by, still watching his cabin fall apart piece by piece, still wondering if he'd make it through another winter. Instead, he had security, respect, protection, but more than that, he had purpose. His simple act of giving water to two frightened children had rippled outward in ways he never could have imagined. It had transformed not just his circumstances, but his place in the world. Spring arrived, and with it came another visitor. This time, it was a single rider, no weapons visible, moving slowly through the clearing. Dalton recognized him immediately. It was Nako himself, the Apache leader, dismounted near the porch, and Dalton stepped outside to meet him. They stood facing each other for a long moment, two men from different worlds who'd found common ground in the simplest of human values. No gestured toward the cabin, then to the thriving corn stalks growing by the creek. His weathered face showed something that might have been satisfaction. He pointed at Dalton, then placed his hand over his heart. Dalton understood. Nako was checking on him, making sure the man who'd saved his daughters was thriving, not just surviving. They're well? Dalton asked, even knowing the language barrier made conversation difficult. Your daughters? Nako seemed to understand the intent, if not every word. He smiled, a rare expression that transformed his severe features, and nodded. He held his hand at two different heights, showing how much they'd grown. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into a leather bag and pulled out a small carved figure, a horse shaped from dark wood. With incredible detail, he pressed into Dalton's hand. From daughters, Nako said in halting words, they make. For you. Dalton's throat tightened. Those two girls who'd been so frightened that day by the creek had made this for him. They remembered. They wanted him to know. They remembered. Tell them thank you, Dalton said quietly. Tell them I think about them. Hope they're happy. Nako nodded, understanding the sentiment, if not every word. He placed his hand on Dalton's shoulder, a gesture of genuine respect between equals. Then he mounted his horse and rode back into the forest, leaving Dalton standing on his porch with a carved wooden horse in his palm. Dalton looked at the small figure, turning it over in his hands. It was rough in places, clearly made by young hands, still learning their craft, but it was real. It was proof that kindness echoed forward, that small acts of compassion created bonds stronger than any threat or treaty. He'd given those girls water when they were dying of thirst. He'd shared his last food when they were starving. He'd offered his only blankets when they were cold. And in return, he'd received more than supplies or protection. He'd received something that couldn't be bought or bargained for. He'd received a place in the world, recognition that he mattered, proof that what he did had value. The massive Apache patrol that had surrounded his house that morning hadn't come for war. They'd come for honor, to show that the favor he'd done for two lost daughters had been seen, understood, and would never be forgotten. Dalton placed the carved horse on the windowsill where the morning light would catch it each day, a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures created the biggest changes, and that honor once given freely was returned in ways that lasted forever. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier where courage and character define a man's true worth. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.